Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Spire and StormGeo webinar in partnership with Port Technology International. My name is Jack Donnelly. I'm the editor here at PTI, and we are delighted to welcome along Marek Pooch, Senior Product Manager of Maritime at Spire Global, and Michael O'Brien, VP of Shipping Operations at StormGeo. This webinar will provide you with a thorough explainer as to how you can optimize emissions through the carbon intensity indicator ratings, understanding how CII is calculated, how AIS can help, and tools to optimize your CII rating going forward. This webinar will be a 45-minute speaker presentation, followed by a 15-minute Q&A. So please do get your questions in all the way throughout. That would be fantastic. We're going to kick things off with Marek. Marek is a seasoned senior products manager for maritime for Spire Global, where he works with AIS and other maritime data. Before coming to Spire, he was also a product manager for fleet management, vessel reporting, and voyage management software. He is an ex-seafarer with experience working on cargo ships as a navigation officer, where he was responsible for reporting that included EU MRV data while on board. Without further ado, I will pass the reins over to Marek and let him take it away. Marek, fire away.
All right. Thank you, Jack. And welcome, everyone. So to give you a brief overview of what we're going through today, just a quick look at the agenda for today. So I will be starting off with an introduction into CII and provide a general overview explaining what CII is and how it's being calculated and how it works, and explain some of the implications and challenges associated to CII, and looking at emissions maybe beyond of CII itself. After that, Michael will take over and go into more detail about optimizing operations of vessels and voyages, and talk about the BIMCO time charter clause and provide some case study examples. After that, we will have the Q&A. So to start off, to provide a very general overview for everyone who maybe heard about CII but hasn't been involved with it in too much detail, the CII is the carbon intensity indicator, and it is a rating system developed by the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, and is a rating system applying to all IMO ships over a gross tonnage of 5,000 and trading internationally. So it covers, unlike, for example, EU MRV, all ships trading worldwide that trade internationally and not only in local waters. CII provides a rating with separate categories from A to E. And beyond that, also has built in a kind of continuous improvement that already started essentially in 2019 with an annual improvement required per year of around 1%, which essentially provides the starting point of the CII data collection that is starting this year and providing the data for the first CII rating in 2024. Going forward, the annual reduction will be at 2%, which is illustrated in the bottom left graph. And further improvements haven't been decided yet, but will most likely increase and will be decided by the IMO. Now, the CII in general is obviously a tool by the IMO and is kind of aimed at achieving the carbon intensity reduction goals of the IMO and its general greenhouse gas emissions strategy. So that essentially means for the carbon intensity, they are aiming at a reduction of the carbon intensity by 2030 of 40% and 70% by 2050. For general greenhouse gas emissions, everything else, aside from including and aside from the CO2, they also aim at 50% reduction by 2050 of all greenhouse gas emissions. Then coming to the next slide regarding the calculation. So for CII to be calculated, there's essentially 5 steps that go into it, with the first step kind of being the most important one, where a factor is calculated based on the total emission of CO2 by a ship, and most commonly that is done by using the through IMO DCS reported fuel consumption over a whole year or the certain period that applies to the vessel, multiplied by the CO2 emission factor. And then this total emission is divided by the total distance sailed by the vessel and its capacity, and specifically the dead weight of the vessel. Then as a second step, going away from the vessel a little bit, a reference line is calculated. And that reference line refers to the ship type and the vessel's capacity. And based on that, you get a reference what a ship of that size kind of have as a reference. And from that reference point in the third step, the required CII is calculated. And this required CII in G3 that kind of ends up being the center point of the rating range, so kind of in the middle of a C rating. And from that point in the fourth step, the individual steps from A, B, C, D, and then to E are calculated from that required CII to determine the different categories. This is essentially already almost everything complete, but last year there was a addition to CII where a fifth step was introduced to allow for some corrections and adjustments of the CII. So for certain factors that are impacting the consumption of the vessel, there are corrections that can be applied, and I will be going into those on the next slide. So for these corrections that can be applied to kind of improve the CII rating, they can be, in a way, be categorized in two different types or categories. One that is related to consumptions of a vessel that don't essentially directly relate to the carriage of the goods. So, for example, for the production of electrical power, boiler consumption, and similar consumptions. And also for ice navigation, where a vessel obviously might have significantly higher consumption just due to the circumstances and not so much due to the efficiency of the vessel, or when there's any situation where life is endangered at sea. And for those cases, the total consumption and also the distance of those periods can be excluded from CII in order to not be negatively impacted by something that is completely out of the control of the ship manager or owner. Then there are some additional correction factors that apply more to the are ship specific in a way that they aim at anything related to kind of construction of the vessel. So whether they have ice class or for specific vessel types, or if vessels had, for example, structural enhancement. So then certain factors can be applied under the specified rules and allow for a slightly improved CII and not be negatively impacted compared to maybe other vessels that do not have these structural disadvantages. There are further corrections and adjustments that have been discussed even previously to the introduction of CII, but a vast number of them have not been implemented and are up for reconsideration in the year 2025. At that point, the IMO will be reviewing the CII data that had been reported and potentially discuss again what other correction factors might be necessary to correct for any unfair disadvantages that ship owners experience. So coming now to the kind of implications and to some extent issues that are related to CII, I'm first going to focus on the side of the calculation of it. And from the formula that we looked at, we can see that one very big impact in the whole efficiency or in the whole CII rating is played by the distance, because that's obviously a variable. The dead weight in the formula was not going to change. So one of the bigger variables in the denominator is the distance and has therefore a large impact on the whole rating. And can lead to some kind of maybe unintended consequences where a vessel stopped and not making any distance, but still consuming fuel and therefore emitting CO2 is performing worse in the rating than the vessel that is underway, even though maybe the underway vessel is in total for the same period of time consuming more. And since, to the next point, deadweight is used instead of actually cargo carried, that can also distort the whole image to some extent, as deadweight cargo assumes the vessel to be in a somewhat loaded, like in full condition essentially, and based on that providing the rating and assuming the corresponding consumptions of the vessel. So if a vessel is actually in ballast conditions, they might actually benefit from being in ballast, consuming less and still making long distances. So not using the actual cargo carried kind of removes the actual efficiency of the vessel in a kind of economic sense, where it doesn't matter how much cargo the vessel actually carries, and it just always assumes the dead weight. And then to the first point, idle time is very negatively impacting all ratings, because the consumption for the whole year is taken, and also the distances for the whole year. So if a vessel is staying for long periods in anchorages or in ports, that will negatively impact the CII rating, and might also lead to some kind of unintended consequences, where maybe owners or charters will decide to change routes, for instead of going a shorter route and maybe having to wait in an anchorage, to use a longer route to achieve a better rating without actually achieving any better emissions or any higher efficiency of the vessel. And due to all these reasons, CII essentially has this kind of a built-in problem that it doesn't really distinguish between a ship that is technically efficient and ships that are operated in a way that is optimized for CII rather than for commercial purposes or actual fuel efficiency. And therefore, the CII regulation in some ways can be gamed if that is really the desired outcome, and could potentially miss some of the intended environmental goals. So to look at it from a different perspective, looking from an organizational perspective of what implications are, one of the first ones, and quite obvious one, I guess, is that it's a polluter pays principle. So all the compliance responsibility is put on the managers and owners to facilitate the compliance with CII, but also the aforementioned improvements to CII. So keeping the vessel improving over time, and if necessary, after bad ratings, for example, trying to improve the ratings to even meet the CII targets. This is obviously kind of an issue because the many factors that impact the CII rating are outside of the control of the owner or manager of the vessel, and make it extremely difficult. So that leads me into the next point, that one of the challenges will be the relationship between charters and operators, and the owners and managers of the vessel. So depending how that relationship maybe already exists, or what kind of relationship these two parties already have, it could potentially create some tension, because inherently the goals are, at least in respect to CII, somewhat in opposing directions. The commercial side of shipping, charters, they obviously try to be as efficient as possible from a commercial standpoint, but that doesn't necessarily make the vessel the most efficient, and the ship owners try to optimize for the vessel efficiency itself. And therefore that relationship has to be considered from both sides, and some clear guidelines or contracts are needed to put in place to avoid any kind of surprises or unwanted effects. And we will get into that a little bit more later on. And then lastly, the burden of compliance, as mentioned in the first point as well, is on the side of the owner's technical managers. So that means in many cases that they obviously have to make sure that the reporting process, the data collection needs, and the correctness of the data reported by ships is handled properly. And that creates obviously some overhead for some of the owners or managers, to even have all these processes in place, and potentially even might need more people to take care of those processes that they maybe didn't need before, at least before EU MRV and IMO-DCS. And they obviously have to make sure that they monitor their vessels and make sure that they stay compliant with CII, and ensure that all the data is actually available and correct at the end of the year. And as mentioned before, all of this kind of means that CII reflects more how a vessel is operated than how it is actually technically efficient. And to kind of illustrate that point, one thing that obviously is kind of true, that the total amount of cargo that will be transported doesn't suddenly change just because of the introduction of the CII regulation. And if we compare, for example, transporting a fixed amount of cargo, in this case, I have here an example of 200,000 metric tons of cargo that would need to be transported. Having that transported by 2 cases in the top and in the bottom, twice the same ship, but one ship only loading half, basically loading the vessel only to half its capacity, and therefore having a potentially lower consumption, but making more trips versus a ship that is fully loaded and potentially consuming more fuel, but having less trips because being fully loaded, being able to transport the same cargo more quickly. Running the calculations on those kind of trips would result in the first ship with a CII rating of A and the second ship with a CII rating of C. However, at the same time, the total CO2 emissions, obviously, of the first case are much higher, also more time, and commercially that might not be very efficient. But if the goal is to optimize CII, you can just see from that illustration essentially that how the CII rating can be in some ways gamed, or you can try to improve artificially in some ways that commercially might not make sense. So from that, I just wanted to kind of go back into the impact of CII, what it means for both the owners and the charters. So first of all, for owners, important thing to keep in mind, obviously, is that the reporting period has started now for 2023, and the first rating will be given based on the data collected in 2023 at the beginning of 2024. So that's the first time a rating will be given. One thing to keep in mind, obviously, for ship owners is that charters might be looking or requesting the ratings, and might be looking at vessels' ratings and take that into consideration when chartering vessels. And therefore, it might be obviously advantageous to try to have actually good ratings if that's the only criteria that charters are looking at. But I will get into that a little bit more on the next slides. I think one important point that will be the next is if a vessel actually gets a CE rating, what happens in that case? And so far, there are not any specific penalties associated with that, except that the ship has to, or the company for that ship has to make provisions in the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan, SEMP, how they would improve from that E rating in the following year to a C rating. But making these provisions, that's essentially the only kind of penalty that is currently applied. But further penalties might come in the future, but so far that seems to be the only one. If a D rating is achieved, that is not necessarily immediately cause for concern, as only if 2 D ratings happen in 2 years, 2 following years, then the same applies like for E rating, where provisions have to be made in the SEMP to improve the vessel to a C rating. Obviously, having all these rating and compliance restrictions in place, that means for ship operator owners that they will be needing to collect more data and independently maybe gather information about the vessel aside from just the reporting of the vessel itself. to verify the data that the vessel is reporting, and maybe to be able to optimize any position, any operations or voyage planning and so on. That's something that Michael will be going on in more detail. Then obviously they will have to, or should be, liaising as much as possible with operators to optimize voyages and plan routes, maybe try to avoid adverse weather conditions, and really work on that relationship with charterers to make sure that the charterer is not kind of abusing their freedom when chartering the vessel, and in the end causing the owner to end up with a rating that is much worse than they expected, or really harming the vessel for maybe future charters. And how that will be handled, I will get into as well, but Michael will have more details on that as well. And as mentioned, there are no other like port state penalties as of now in place. So the only things that happen if you don't actually meet the targets are the changes to the SEMP. So on the basis of the IMO regulations, what the specific penalties are going to be in the future, if maybe states will actually implement more penalties, that's I guess something that is yet to come, that we still have to see. But as of now, there's not too much associated with that. For charterers, that obviously the whole CII topic is something very, maybe not very new, but something I guess that they didn't have to deal with before if they try to avoid it, as most of the compliance and regulations were the responsibility of the owners. Now with CII, they might potentially have more responsibilities put on them if a vessel is chartered, and they will, during the negotiations with the owners, whatever charter parties agreed upon, might now or in the future include charter party clauses that have some expectations or limitations on what the on the CII itself. And one of the first ones, I will get back into it, is BIMCO that have already announced a time charter clause. Then obviously using CII in the decision-making process is something to consider for charterers, that they shouldn't be relying too much on it, as due to the examples I have given before, CII rating can be somewhat misleading. It might indicate a quite efficient ship to have a bad rating simply because it was operated in a less optimal way. And at the same time, you can have a less efficient vessel that was just operated all the time and had low anchorage times or port stays, and might appear more efficient without actually being more efficient. So that's something to look out for charterers, to not rely too much on the CII itself. And it obviously makes sense if they are liaising with the owners to see, okay, how can we meet our CII targets, to look at voyage optimization and take that into consideration, but that's something that Michael will go into more detail. So the only thing we can really say from our side is to kind of make a plea to look somewhat beyond the CII and look for actually meaningful efficiency improvements that can be made to vessels, as the CII itself isn't a guarantee for actually good efficiency of a vessel. And now I want to get into addressing the challenges that are associated with CII. And first of all, obviously, more data are allow for better decisions. So improving data collection and reporting is going to be an important factor. And optimizing operations, that's something that Michael will speak to, can greatly help in that aspect. And obviously having good cooperation with all the parties in the supply chain, between the charters, between the owners, that's going to be critical to allow for actually a balance between good ratings and actually being commercially efficient and environmentally efficient. And as I alluded to before, there are already some frameworks coming into place for charter party clauses that will kind of regulate that relationship between charters and owners if they agree to. And the first one being the BIMCO time charter clause, where there's some responsibilities associated to the charterer and to the ship owner, and taking in some ways care of that. And so far there was only a time charter clause, but a voyage charter clause is also expected at a later time. And with that, we kind of really want to highlight that you might want to look beyond just the CII and look at emissions and put really emissions in focus. Because if we reconsider everything, what are the real goals we as a society, I guess, try to achieve? And that's obviously to reduce the total emissions that vessels create, and improving the transport work, be more efficient in the cargoes we carry, and reduce the emissions, and thereby obviously also potentially, depending on the methods used, even reducing operating costs in some cases. So what actions can be taken? Obviously, CII should be taken seriously and should be complied with. However, it might be worth not aiming too high and maybe looking at the real efficiency of the vessel and being commercially efficient instead of trying to aim for the best rating alone, because that itself doesn't really correspond to most efficient operations. So it might be worth accepting lower ratings, at least for this transitional period, until potentially further correction factors and adjustments to CII are introduced by the IMO that allow for maybe more precise evaluation of the efficiency of the vessel, like, for example, looking at transport work and total emissions. And the main goal obviously being optimizing operations to move cargo as efficiently as possible and improve the trade flows and maybe reduce ballast legs. That is something that negatively impacts the CII, but obviously makes the supply chain as a whole more efficient. Other things to look at are obviously alternative fuels or any kind of technical improvements that can be implemented on the vessel side. So looking ahead, in December, there was a meeting by the IMO where they haven't decided, but discussed further changes to IMO DCS, where potentially they would include cargo data in the reporting, which has so far been excluded. There was no cargo data that needed to be reported, and would therefore allow looking at transport work. And as mentioned before, in 2025, there will be a review by the IMO of CII, taking into consideration transport work potentially and these further correction and factors and voyage adjustments. And obviously starting next year as well is the European Union emission trading scheme that is kind of at odds with CII in some ways, as it puts a price to the total emissions and therefore kind of aims more at improving the overall efficiency of ships and transporting cargo, because the total amount of CO2 emitted will have a price, and that might be more effective and might lead in some cases to opposing goals trying to optimize for the one or for CII, for EU ETS or for CII. So that will be a balancing act trying to stay within that. But that's something to consider already this year, even if it doesn't apply this year already. And with that, I would like to hand over to Michael and the second part of this presentation, and Jack will provide some more details about Michael. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marek. That was a fantastic start to the presentation. And now for Michael's section. As Vice President of Shipping Operations, Michael heads up StormGeo's creative product team in the shipping division and provides shipping clients with cutting-edge solutions that ensure each voyage's safety, efficiency, and sustainability. Over the course of 25 years, Michael has had a hand in planning and executing more than 500,000 voyages, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in savings, reductions in fuel consumption, and the removal of tens and thousands of tons of greenhouse gases from the environment. Michael, that's a pretty good intro. I'll let you take it away from now. Please do go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jack, and thanks, Marek. As we heard Marek talk about, there's a great deal of complexity, but there's also a great deal of opportunity, I think, with what CII is bringing to us. And what I'd like to do is spend the next few minutes talking about ways that we can probably simplify the complexity. and look at safety, efficiency, and environmental compliance from that light. And to that end, I think it's probably worthwhile to give a kind of a refresher as to what exactly voyage optimization is trying to achieve. And to preface that, it's important to recognize that the IMO and Marintech, if you recall, it was probably about 10 or 15 years ago now. They did a study, and this was an industry-wide study, and they determined that voyage optimization can save between 1% and 3% on fuel. And if you do just-in-time voyage optimization, that can save an additional 2 to 4% in your fuel costs. So it obviously has a very profound impact on efficiency, but it's much more than that. Voyage optimization is out there to ensure the safety of the crew, the vessel, and the cargo. We look to maximize, of course, the voyage commercial performance while minimizing the environmental impact. And voyage optimization comes in different flavors to try and deal with the unique situations that are out there. You might have vessels that are operating inside of a charter party, outside of a charter party. You might have a fixed arrival time. There's different flavors on how to apply voyage optimization to get the most out of it. And of course, one of the key things that it does is it allows us to provide information to users with regard to how a vessel is performing against a charter party. This can be very important, and it'll have some implications too when I talk about the BIMCO clause in a few moments. So what I'd like to do now is kind of talk about a new journey, if you will, that the world of CII is going to bring to us. And as part of that journey, it comes, we'll have a situation where, of course, we need to make decisions. We have to support the captain and the crew in making decisions on how to get efficiently across the ocean. And one of the key and fundamental steps to that is understanding, of course, where the vessel is and where has the vessel been, and utilize that data to do a number of calculations. And we use Spire's data. And why is that? We find that it has fantastic global coverage. We know that there are tools built into it to mitigate duplicate MMSI numbers, which can add some ambiguity or cloud the results of the AIS data. And from my perspective, it's extremely reliable. So, of course, you have this key fundamental piece of data, which then, if we move a little bit further on into this journey, is core in processing and looking at various optimization algorithms. We're looking at utilizing this data to help supplement machine learning algorithms as it comes to the computation of speed and consumption. And this is all data which is then processed and is providing a great deal of, I'd say, intelligent insight by systems that can be then consumed by the captain directly and enhanced by teams of professionals. So what we look to do is take all of this enormous amount of valuable technological data coming out of the systems, and then I would say distill it in a way that is most easily digested and is most easily communicated to the maritime community, be it ashore or on board the vessel. And key to that is being able to, I'd say, look at potential differences between model data, using experience to add some insight and I would say some various thoughts on how a particular situation may play out. And that can be done any number of ways. It can be done through a message, or actually just picking up the telephone and having conversations with people. So it's a simplified journey, but it's one where we feel the human element is extremely important in order to complete it successfully, or with the greatest results, I should say. And then moving on in that journey, we see a graph similar to what Marek shared, and this is just representing how all of this ultimately can be then used to look at environmental or technical evaluations, be it MRV, IMO DCS, or CII, which will, of course, we've been talking about in some detail here. And again, in the technical side and in the environmental compliance side, again, having that precise distance information is very critical, and that's where we rely quite heavily on the data that we get from Spire in terms of AIS. And then if we move ahead here, pardon me. And if we move ahead, then we're looking at the BIMCO clause. So what I'd like to do is kind of do a use case run through on what this new journey might look like. And the BIMCO clause does introduce a lot of new, interesting aspects to the relationship between an owner and a charterer. As Marek alluded to, there's a great opportunity here to have better collaboration between owners and charterers. But at the same time, there are some things that everyone's going to need to be quite aware of in order to make sure that we at least limit the potential for disputes to arise. So there's a few key terms: the agreed CII, and that's kind of represented in that little image I have on the screen there. The agreed CII is just as the name suggests. It's the CII that the two parties agree on in the charter party to achieve, and BIMCO is recommending that you target above the middle C range, because we do know that in general the CI trajectories are showing the necessity to improve efficiency by about 2% annually. So the recommendation is they'd like you to shoot a little bit higher, but it all has to be taken into consideration. Like Marek said, you need to during this transition period, it might be necessary to take that with a grain of salt. But at the end of the day, it has to be something that both parties agree upon. The CP attained CII is the ongoing CII from the moment that the ship has taken delivery and what she's actually achieving. And this is, of course, extremely important, and it's something that both parties are going to have to keep a close eye on. And there's a potential for an owner in this case to have to maintain two sets of data. And why is that? Because the BIMCO clause allows the charterer to deduct, if agreed upon, certain off-hire periods. However, those off-hire periods can't be excluded from the overall annual attained CII. So just keep in mind that while a vessel is out, there could be the necessity to really maintain two sets of data, one for the overall CII and one that's going to be representing the CP attained. The projected attained CII is an extrapolation out through the duration of the charter or through the end of the year if the charter goes into the next year. And the projected attained CII is something that I can explain a bit more, and how you might be able to utilize some tools to help simplify your journey in terms of understanding where I need to be when I redeliver this ship. There are the traditional CP terms still do apply, but there's potentially overridden by the need to comply with CII. And this is something I think both owners and charterers should be very much aware of. So if you look at this clause G, there are provisions in there where if a vessel's attained CII is above the agreed CII, that after some period of time where both parties can talk about how to resolve this, that the owner can really actually take control, where they can essentially not follow the charterer's orders, they can reduce speed, and they essentially are given a great deal of, I'd say, power in order to bring the vessel into CII compliance. And it's important to keep that in mind. And while the warranties for speed and consumption do continue to be applied in this case, so if you have an agreed charter party speed and consumption, there can still be a claim for time lost and fuel overconsumed. But if you read what I've highlighted there, any of those claims really can't be used to help you achieve or be an excuse not to achieve your CII goals. And you can envision a potentially delicate situation here where a vessel has a very significant overconsumption of fuel, which pushes you above the agreed CII, at which case then the owner has the potential to step in and take some mitigating factors. So in this rather specific example, you could envision a case where through no fault of the operator, the vessel is underperforming and then ultimately results in the vessel not achieving the agreed upon CII, and there's some kind of modification to their commercial operation of the ship. So what that boils down to is that owners and charterers really need to keep a close eye on things. And that's going to start with high quality reported data and in a good sequence as well, right? You want to make sure you have a good handle on the reporting of data. It'll be very important to understand the impact of CII and the impact against the agreed CII. And you'll want to employ tools to understand your CII now and in the future. And process I described just a few moments ago, voyage optimization, is actually mentioned specifically in the BIMCO clause as a tool to help both owners and charterers reach the CII targets. So now if we take a look at this journey, how does it start off? It really starts off with you knowing, where am I right now in terms of CII? And that vision can be understanding what your attained CII is. If I'm an owner operating the vessel, you can project out a variety of different simulations to see where your vessel is going to be. And you can even have vision into where, basis the trajectories that your vessel sits in, where that vessel is going to degrade if you maintain the exact same operating profile, where she's going to degrade into the next lower category. So these are all important things from an owner's perspective, but if we look at it from a owner and charterer perspective, this is a good starting point, because we need to have a clear understanding of what the delivery CII is and what that agreed CII is. And this kind of information will make it very, I'd say, clear to have those kind of negotiations up front. And as the charterer goes on, right, having a really clear insight as to what the ongoing CII is, or as the BIMCO clause, what the CP attained CII is going to be really important, and it's going to help prevent or mitigate potential disputes by making sure that there's a good agreement on where that's headed. And then what's the next step in this journey? It's where do I need to be? And where do I need to be starts with doing some simulations. And what I've included here is a view of what we call a redelivery of simulation. And while there's a lot of different boxes with different colors here, and it may be a little bit difficult to see, on the y-axis you have some drafts, and on the x-axis you have a variety of speeds and what they correlate to in terms of a CII rating. And then there's also in that upper left, or excuse me, the upper right-hand side, the ability to also view that in terms of grams of CO2 per deadweight ton nautical mile. Now, envision a situation where you have an agreed upon CII, and now you need to simulate, all right, I need to commercially operate this vessel, and I also have to think in terms of where I need to be when I redeliver this vessel. So in this particular simulation that I pulled out, you could look and say that, okay, in this case, I want to be running her at about 9 meters of draft, and I want to redeliver it at 2.39 grams of CO2 per deadweight ton nautical mile. And with that, it would simulate out to a 11.5 knot speed. So now you know where you started, you know where you need to be in order to be compliant with CII. And then how can we employ a variety of voyage optimization tools to really help you achieve that target. One of those ways is by taking that ordered or targeted 11.5 knots and applying something called constant power. And to illustrate constant power, I think it's useful in a slide like this to compare it to constant RPM. So what you're looking at here is a variety of weather conditions. As the white line is going up and down, it's indicating changes, increasing and decreasing weather conditions. And when you're applying constant RPM, it's going to require that you apply additional power to overcome weather when it's increasingly bad, and reduce power when it's getting better. And overall, that's a less than optimal way to operate the vessel. And what we try and do is support the vessel in terms of constant power. And in this case, what's happening is, as the weather is increasing and decreasing in intensity, the MCR percentage is remaining roughly the same. And what's happening is the RPMs are changing over time. So as I encounter more hull resistance, my RPMs come down. I'm not altering my power application for the most part. And that then could be illustrated here in a real world example on a voyage that came across from Rotterdam to Savannah, Georgia. And in this case, the voyage was executed on a constant power regime. And we simulated it at what the results would have been from a constant RPM standpoint. And you can see that when operated as constant power, the fuel consumption was 421.6 metric tons. And when she was operated at constant RPM, that was actually at 438.1 tons. So a significant increase in efficiency by running her at constant power. And then the next step in this journey is really looking at this and going beyond compliance. Because as Marek alluded to, right, the CII is a way of measuring your carbon versus your deadweight ton nautical miles. It doesn't necessarily indicate if you're operating the vessel as efficiently as it could be. So in this slide here, what you're looking at are 3 routes going from the northwestern United States over to Tokyo. And we have a route which is far north going through the Bering Sea. That's what we call the efficient route. We have a route that's more or less a rhumb line straight across through the middle of the two. And that's what we're calling a ultra inefficient route, or excuse me, a very inefficient route. And then the longer route, which drops down to the southwest and then across on a parallel sail, we're referring to as an ultra inefficient route. And why is that? This red line from west to east is representing a typical pattern in the wintertime, where you have low pressure centers tracking to the south of the Aleutian Islands. And that northern route is passing north of that, and you tend to get more time of following conditions, less head weather. Conversely, on those southern routes that are longer and to the south of the low track, you're actually putting the vessel into areas of more prolonged southwest, northwest wind conditions and heavier northwest swells. And how does that manifest? How it manifests is that in this example, you can see that the 3 voyages, or the 3 routes, all have very similar carbon intensities. So on the very right-hand side, the carbon intensities are all rather similar. And interestingly enough, the voyage with the lowest carbon intensity is what we're calling the ultra inefficient route. It's that one that came way to the south. It has 16.67 grams of CO2 per deadweight ton nautical mile. And when we look at it from an overall standpoint, and this idea of going beyond compliance, it actually added almost 900 metric tons of CO2 to the atmosphere. It's a 17% by mass increase over the efficient route. So this is something that I think is very important to keep in mind as you're navigating the waters and trying to simplify your journey dealing with CII. And with that, I'd like to just thank you for your interest, and I'd like to thank Spire for hosting this conversation.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was absolutely fantastic. And we have got a billion questions coming in, which is really good as well. We'll bring Marek back as well. And I will just divvy out some questions to you guys, and please answer on what you're comfortable on and what you're not. I will start with what has been the highest rated question so far is, will CII ratings be made public? I don't know if anybody wants to answer that. Marek, would you like to start?
Sure. So there have been calls to make it public, but as far as I know, nothing has actually been put in place to really do that. And so far, the IMO has been quite secretive about the reported IMO DCS data. So until something actually is in place, I wouldn't have too high expectations.
Michael?
Yeah, the same. As we know, MRV data is made available, but the IMO has not made that data. It's kept it anonymous. So to my knowledge, that's the state of this as well. But yeah.
And then playing off that, are the ports required to record CII for vessels in a port?
I can start with that too. Yeah, I mean, the CII it includes your at sea, your maneuvering, and your in-port consumption. So absolutely, and as Marek was showing, it can be lengthy times in port can actually be detrimental to your CII, where you're not moving yet you're still consuming, because the distance is in the denominator of the equation. Then consumption without any additional mileage is going to ultimately penalize you a little bit in your CII.
Marek, anything else there?
Not really, but I think maybe just to there was a comment in the chat as well to that obviously the CII is a operational indicator and not so much a technical one. That's obviously what we have EOI or EXI for, or the EDI, design index. But still, obviously, the CII kind of still has those issues that it's imperfect in that sense that even if it's trying to be an operational indicator, it doesn't really indicate good operational efficiency, because you could carry no cargo for a whole year. That doesn't commercially make sense, but that would be possible. You could have a good rating and not have carried anything. So it doesn't really serve as a very good operational indicator, I would say. So some of these changes that maybe are expected, they might be needed. And I would expect in 2025, when the IMO reviews CII, that some changes will come.
Fantastic. Would there be any advantages to ship owners or operators to maintain an A or B rating? Advantages in a financial sense?
Yeah, I can jump in.
Ahead, yeah.
Now, I'm certainly not the expert here, but on this particular topic, but I did listen to the BIMCO webinar, and while they were quite clear that that there's no regulatory compliance. So as long as you're not getting a D rating for 3 consecutive years and you're not getting an E, then you don't have to take action to rectify the situation. With that said, the BIMCO clause recommendation is that you aim for that middle C or better. But I don't. Marek, maybe you can add additional context. I don't believe there's any financial incentive to go for an A or a B.
Yes, correct. As far as we know, there's no direct financial incentive. However, of course, depending on how charters look at this, if charters are going to be looking into CII ratings to determine whether they want to charter a vessel or not, that might have obviously financial implications. But I think that's one thing we were trying to get across, that maybe charters shouldn't be looking only at CII.
Sure. We have a question in from Mary, which is, will there be publicly available tools to do simulations? Do you know anything about that? Mike, do you want to start?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know that there's various vendors out there, including StormGeo, that are making tools available for simulation. So I can speak from our perspective. We have simulation tools that look at the next voyage. We have simulation tools that look for a redelivery period, and we have simulation tools that look to the end of the year. And there's also a specific module that's called CII for charterers. So I can speak specifically to us, but as far as publicly available, that would be available through, say, a BIMCO or something like that. I'm not aware of that.
Yeah. Marek, anything else there?
No, nothing additional to Michael.
Michael, I think we have another question here for you from Zach. For planning network and optimizing port calls, emissions is one thing, but then other factors such as cost, volume demand versus capacity, and etc. Also play roles. Is your simulation tool able to factor in other factors beyond emissions?
Yeah. So what it looks at is the operational profile of the vessel. So we're looking at, all right, the duration of the charter is, say, 180 days back to redelivery. How many days of that am I expecting to be idle? How many days of that am I expecting to be working cargo? And the difference, of course, would be your at-sea time. And there are other provisions in there to take into consideration other factors. You can enter the various types of fuel that you'd be consuming. And that is at the end of the day is going to yield the results that allow you to make decisions forward-looking.
Just to let the viewers know, there has been a CII calculator link just put in the chat. If anybody wants to be made aware of that. Have a look through the next questions. Will the agreed CII be calculated on a journey basis, Marek?
No, that's essentially based on the IMO DCS data, which are annual. So that basically means from the 1st of January, usually at midnight, until the end of the year, regardless of the specific journey. At least for IMO DCS, that's different for EU MRE, but for IMO DCS and therefore for CII, it's on a time range basis and not a voyage basis.
Fantastic.
Except for time charter, sorry, just one comment for the time charter or other purposes like what Michael alluded to with the charter party clauses that can have obviously kind of unofficial ratings that will be given on a voyage basis during the year, but that is only between the commercial parties, not the official rating.
Perfect. How do you work with container carriers versus bulk and tankers? Is there less impact in container shipping due to this lower ETA flexibility given pro forma slots? Michael, I think that might be one for you.
Yeah, well, this is going to be a challenge, right? Because, pro forma schedules are set up to achieve a particular speed. And it could very well mean that speed now that the schedule is currently built upon is not going to be able to achieve the CII targets that are going to be set out. So the short answer to that is, it could have fairly significant impact on schedules. Perfect.
We have another question. Can you inform on what the correction formula means for atypical ships? Does it mean all fuel from an auxiliary engine and boiler is in practice deducted from the CII numerator? Marek, could you take that one?
Yeah, sure. I think that's kind of specified in the whole CII regulation in more detail. That might be something worth looking at, but essentially that would have to be proven, which is probably the most difficult part, what the consumption is actually used for, because auxiliary engines, they obviously run just a whole engine, and what they do is obviously produce electricity or other things. But I think proving the use of that will be the most challenging part, but the details for that are in the CII regulation.
Michael, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, there's a host of correction factors, mainly impacting the the largest segment would be the tanker segment that's getting impacted by the correction factors. Yeah, and as Marek said, there's quite a few, and it should be pointed out that they're not locked in stone yet either, right? There's a likelihood that they're going to, these correction factors and even some of the ways that CI is computed is going to be reevaluated a little bit based on feedback in the first year here. So yeah, I would echo what Marek said there. When it comes to the specifics, it's really better off to look at the CII regulation. You can see, is my pump activity while I'm in port, something that could be corrected, et cetera, et cetera.
Fantastic. We've hit 2:00 UK time here, but I've been given the go ahead to go for another 10 minutes. If that's okay, Marek and Michael, we have a lot of questions to get through. Are we both okay with that? We can do 5 more minutes. Perfect.
Sure.
Marek, you had in your presentations the ways that it can be gamed, CII. Is there a plan to review the CII method to fix the ways that it can be gamed? Is that the 2025 review that you mentioned there, Marek?
Yes, correct. At least that's in for now intended date. Obviously, the IMO has these regular MEPC meetings where they discuss those kind of things. What is being reported in IMO DCS as well. So there are other things happening before that, but the official review is planned at least for 2025, and I think that will be at least to some extent taking into account those factors, and maybe not so much in trying to avoid the gaming aspect of it, because I think the commercial pressure will impact that enough to maybe not make that feasible. But at the same time, if the IMO actually decides to take into account the cargo quantity and cargo weight, then that will have a significant impact, because that makes the gaming less feasible, because you cannot just go around in circles in ballast. That's not going to be an option anymore, because the cargo quantity will then actually matter and impact the CII rating. So if that happens, that would alleviate some of these gaming possibilities.
Is CII a mandatory requirement for each ship? And what happens when the ships get a poor rating? Mike, I don't know if you want to take that one.
Yeah, so Marek, when he was going with regulation, yeah, it's required for vessels above 5,000 gross tons, and it does apply to all vessels in that category. When it comes, I'm sorry, Jack, if you could reread the second part of that question.
Yeah, no, what happens when a ship gets a poor rating?
Yes. So when it gets a poor rating, so basically, if you have a D rating for 3 consecutive reporting periods, or you have an E rating for 1 period, it requires you to go into your SCEMP Part 3 and have prescriptive measures to actually mitigate and improve your rating. So it does require that kind of action. Yeah.
Fantastic. Roy has put in a question. It will be interesting to see the impact on CII for ships calling at ports that install shorter ship power. Any comments on that, Marek?
Sure. I mean, one of the big impacts, as discussed before, was that the whole consumption of the entire year is taken and then divided by the distance and dead weight. And staying in port and actually receiving shore power will obviously reduce that consumption. So any consumption that would otherwise happen during port stay, where 0 distance is made, which normally results in a really bad rating, in this case would be kind of alleviated, because you don't make distance, but you also don't consume directly the CO2, at least from the ship, and that's the only one that's measured in CII.
Mike, anything to add there?
No, I think Marek got it covered nicely.
Fantastic. We're coming to the tail end of some of our questions here now. We have one in from Amit. How is constant power achieved? Usually vessels run at a set RPM. Mike, would you like to start?
Yeah. Well, generally speaking, running at a constant RPM is going to end up ultimately causing for reduced efficiency. And it could potentially also, in some cases, be less safe in terms of the vessel handling and the cargo. Just envision if you're riding a bicycle, right? If you're trying to maintain a constant number of RPMs, and you're going up a hill, how much more power do you have to put into that to get up that hill? So it's an extremely, there's been a lot of data to show that there's an extreme savings when looking at the running at a constant power and allowing the RPMs to come down when there is additional resistance to the hull.
Fantastic. Marek, did you have anything to tack on there?
No, nothing to add from my side.
Perfect. Just finally, we'll wrap up with this one. MRV is accessible, but IMO data is not accessible. Why is the confidentiality maintained by the IMO? Marek, did you want to start on that? Sounds a bit of a tricky question.
Sure. There's not much that I think I can add, because I obviously cannot speak for the IMO and their reasons of why they keep it secret or not. But given the calls for the CII being published, potentially that could impact, at least in long term, for that to change. But for the time being, I guess that's the IMO's decision, and I guess there's not much that I can justify for them.
Mike, did you have anything else to say there?
Yeah, nothing in particular, aside from the fact that there is a general desire out of these environmental regulations to share more information. So I would kind of agree with Marek there that based on that, it seems likely that an eventual sharing of that information is something that would happen, but it's up to the IMO, of course.
Fantastic. Well, that's everything from us, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mike. And thank you, Marek, for giving up the time. We've gone over an hour here. Thank you, everybody, for giving in the questions. It's been fantastic. If you just have a look at the end here, you have all of the information for Spire and for StormGeo as well. And you can see Mike's and Marek's LinkedIn as well. And this presentation will be available on demand. We'll go up straight away. I'll be recording right now and go up in about 10 minutes or so. So if anybody else would like to share a link or watch on demand, then that's availability as well. Thank you from PTI's side. We love doing these webinars, and we've had a really great hour. And as you said, there's your contact details for anybody else who would like to get in touch. So that's everything from us. Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Marek, again. And we'll see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.